First category to talk about is culture. And so when it comes to culture and how diverse cultures mourn, of course, this is not an all-inclusive list. There are many more cultures than this. So the first culture we're going to talk about is the Middle East. There's quite a few different cultures there in the Middle East, but one of them, whenever someone dies, the women will come together and they'll share stories about the person who's died. Other cultures in the Middle East, if someone is grieving, they will come out into the streets and they will begin to cry. And they'll walk down that street. And anyone else there on that same street, if they're mourning as well, they'll come out of their house as well. And they'll walk with that person and they'll cry together. And so by the time they get to the end of the street, there could be 15, 20 people all gathered together, just crying and weeping and letting out their sorrow. In Mexico, there's the Day of the Dead. It's a 2-day celebration, just giving remembrance of those who have gone on before them. In Australia, there's this concept called the death wail. And this concept is also very familiar in Africa as well. But the death wail is when an individual is able to yell and scream as loud as they need to let out all the anguish and the pain that they're experiencing from their loss. And family and friends, they encourage the person to yell and to scream and to let out that anguish. In Africa, certain countries in Africa, the first year after a loss, they are able to grieve and mourn however they need to. And then after that first year, on that 1-year anniversary, everyone in the community comes together and they have this huge celebration of the person who's died. Think about African American community. Not all African Americans celebrate or celebrate deaths the same way. But most African Americans who come from more of a Christian background do have the same structure when it comes to how they mourn and grieve. And there's an event called a homegoing, Home-E, homegoing. And so the concept comes from the Christian belief, and also it was something that was very held on strongly to, more specifically due to slavery. Because slavery was a very brutal time to be living. And there is this concept of this is not our home. This is not the end of the story. When we go to heaven, that is our home. That is where we will be free. That is where we will not experience the hurt and the pain and the anguish that we're experiencing now in slavery. So that concept of a home going was a huge, something very hopeful that was held on to. And it was a huge celebration as well. And still to this day, it's seen as a celebration that the person is in a place of peace now. And so when it comes to homegoings, it can be an all-day event or as long as 3 hours. And so initially, we all meet at a local place. It could be a church, it could be a community center of some sort. And we have a celebration. So we talk about the person who's died. People will get up and tell stories about the person who's died. There's music that's very lively. So there's clapping, there's singing, there's dancing, because it really is a celebration. And then there's usually a spiritual leader of some sort who will get up and it will speak as well. And then after that, we go to a second location, which is the burial site. And so we all gather together and we bury the person. And there's variations on this as well. Most African Americans, when the person is buried into the ground, we end up leaving. And we'll say a few words, the person's buried, and then we leave. Depending on how close the family is to their roots, to the African roots, they will stay the entire time. And while the person's body is being lowered into the ground, they will sing hymns, they will sing spiritual songs. And then after that, we go to a third location. At this third location is where we have food and we eat, we fellowship with each other, we catch up with each other, see how everyone's doing. We might even tell stories about the person as well. So again, as you can see, this can be an all-day event. And then going to the early 1800s here in the U.S. In the U.S. in the 1800s, it was all about appearances. So it's all about dressing in black. Black was a sign of mourning, sign of grieving. And as the person was slowly coming out of the grieving process, they began to wear softer colors, such as lilac, or they wore black and white together. They slowly began to wear jewelry as well. The belief was the longer the person wore black, it's a direct correlation to how much that person loved that other person. And then in 1917, Freud wrote an essay called Mourning and Melancholia. Mourning and Melancholia shares this concept of breaking ties as quickly as possible to move on and to return back to someone's normal level of functioning. And some of you might be familiar with the grief work model. This is where the grief work model comes from. Again, stressing the importance of moving on as quickly as possible. And this ran rampant here in the US. Still to this day, we hear some of that language. The language such as, it's time for you to let go. It's time for you to move on. You're not over this yet? Let them go. That language comes directly from Mourning and Melancholia. Many people may not realize this, but Freud actually had several children. He had 6 children, and unfortunately, one of his daughters died. And when his daughter died, he realized that this message that he gave out to break ties as quickly as possible, to move on as quickly as possible, actually was very unhealthy. And he realized it's about staying connected to the person who's died. And he sent out another message saying, hey, I was wrong, you guys. It's about staying connected. But unfortunately, this initial message from Mourning Melancholia, again, had run rampant. And that's what people held on to. And so I'm going to pause just for a moment and see what you guys shared in the chat. So I'm seeing in Rwanda, there's 1 week where the country collectively grieves for those who were murdered during the genocide. Wow, that's beautiful. They reenact the genocide and share about the factors that led to its occurrence. Outside of this week, though, the deaths are not discussed openly because it is no longer considered socially appropriate. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'll just read just one more. In Mexico, there is also a journey that takes place where family and friends carry the casket from the place where the service took place to the place where the individual will be buried, regardless of the distance. Wow. It can be miles that this casket is carried by family and friends. Thank you for sharing that. And as you can see, there's so many variations when it comes to how cultures grieve and how cultures mourn. And so when a client is coming in, it's about meeting them where they're at, letting them be the expert, and sitting with them in those spaces and asking them, what is it like to live here in the US and the way you guys mourn is so different than how it is here in the US? What are some maybe comments people are saying towards you? How does it make you feel? And again, we're going to go into more detail on how to have those conversations, more in-depth conversations with our clients. So every aspect of that grief that they're experiencing is acknowledged. Not only the loss itself that they've experienced, but also the additional losses they're experiencing because others are minimizing. Others are not acknowledging their grief. Right, next we'll talk about spirituality. Again, there is a whole other list of spiritual orientations and different religions, but because of time, these are the 4 ones I pulled out. And so before we dive into spirituality and religions, I do want to let you guys know, a little self-disclosure, I by no means am a religious expert, but there are some aspects in each of these religions that we're going to talk about that I just want to give an overview of so you guys can see just how vastly different it is. So I have several friends who identify themselves within the Buddhist community. And within Buddhism, there's this concept called reincarnation. And so the belief, before we go into reincarnation, take a step back. The belief when it comes to death is that death is natural. It is inevitable. It is a part of living. And just that concept alone can promote a lot of peace and acceptance for individuals versus in Western society, we kind of see death as something that is unnatural and we try to avoid it as much as possible. Think about someone who's on their deathbed. What do we do? Well, what treatment do they need? What medication do they need? What do we need to do to keep them alive as long as possible? So we try to avoid death, we try to fight death. Within the Buddhist community, it's all about embracing it and accepting that it's natural. So we even see a differentiation in just that experience and perspective of death. Within the Buddhist community, there's this concept called reincarnation. And so when it comes to reincarnation, it's the belief that we each have a spirit and we each have a physical body. And so when that spirit, and so when our physical body dies, the spirit is then reborn into new life here on earth. Within Christianity, there's even variations on the Christian umbrella. So there's many different denominations on the Christian umbrella. But the overall agreement is that everyone has this predestined time, day and time when they'll die. And each of us have a spirit, each of us have a physical body. When the physical body dies, the spirit goes to a place of perfection. And in this section, there's variations. Some people believe that the spirit goes to a place of perfection. Others believe that the spirit can go to a place of eternal suffering. And the others believe that there's this in-between place where the spirit sits in. So again, as you can see, there's a variation. Within the Islamic faith, the belief is that Allah decides when a person dies. And so we all have a physical body. And when a physical body dies, the individual stays buried. And when the day of judgment happens, the person either goes to a place of perfection or goes to a place of spiritual suffering. Within atheism, individuals are free to adopt whatever belief system they choose to believe. It could be reincarnation. It could believe that we simply cease to exist. So it really is up to them. And so again, as you see, there's so many variations. And it's crucial for us to meet our clients where they're at. Let's say we come from the Buddhist faith and we have a client coming in who is also Buddhist. It's important that we meet them where they're at, not make assumptions of, oh, because you're Buddhist, this is what you believe. This is probably attachment that you have to your spiritual orientation. So I want you to pause for a moment. I want you to think about maybe friends you have who come from your own spiritual orientation, who come from your religion. Now I want you to think about someone who is very devout to your religion. Now think about the person who may not be as devout. It's all the same religion, all the same spiritual orientation, but there's different levels of connection, different levels of devoutness, different levels of identity within their spiritual orientation. And so again, it's crucial for us to meet our clients where they're at and to not make assumptions, even if we do come from the same background. So I'll give a quick example. There's a client I was working with several years ago. She had come in due to um, challenges with work. Unfortunately, during that time, her aunt ended up dying. And I was sitting with her in that grief. And she was upset, very sad, very heartbroken. As we were talking about the loss, she also shared that her aunt was cremated. And it upset her that her aunt was cremated. And she continued on with the story. Session after session, she kept mentioning her aunt being cremated. And I took mental note of it, I'm seeing a theme. She keeps talking about her aunt being cremated. I don't see what the big deal is. Cremation, burial, person has died. I'm not seeing the big deal about it. So we kept going with sessions. And then one day she mentioned it again, and I could see a visceral reaction. She physically became agitated about her parents cremating her aunt. And so I paused for a moment and I put my thoughts, my bias aside. And I asked her, and I mentioned, I noticed the past few sessions you keep mentioning your aunt's being cremated, and I can see you're very upset about her. Help me understand your perspective. And she shared with me that she was very angry with her parents, angry that her parents cremated her aunt versus buried her aunt. And she shared with me kind of that perspective from the Christian background. And I normalized that experience. I validated her experience. You're going to hear me say that quite a bit throughout today's training, the importance of normalizing and validating. And I sat with her in that space and I gave her space to let out her anger. We did a lot of empty chair method where I had her sit in one spot and there's an empty chair across from her. And she imagined talking to her parents about the reason why they cremated her aunt. Come to find out, after she had the conversation with her parents, they ended up cremating her aunt because they couldn't afford to bury her. It was more affordable to cremate her aunt. Now, if I had been a clinician who just pushed past it, saying, well, it's not that big of a deal, cremation, burial, the person has died, you guys gave acknowledgement, you had a service, and when I had kept going, my client's anger would have turned into bitterness. And as we all know, Bitterness is very, very challenging to work through. It's much easier to help our clients who are angry versus clients who are bitter because bitterness impacts every aspect of someone's life.